Welcome to the season 2 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar.
India recently enforced a ban on single use plastic items across the country. The move will have a ripple impact across several industries, from FMCG to food packaging. Experts, however, view this as a bold step towards waste management in the country. Of this, an impeding concern is over renewable energy waste. If India were to meet its 500 gigawatt target of renewable energy, estimates reveal solar industry alone could generate over 34,600 tons of cumulative waste by 2030. To understand how India manages its waste currently, including solar waste, and what can be done about managing growing quantum of energy and industrial waste, we interviewed Bharati Chaturvedi, founder and director of Chintan Environmental Research and Action Group. Bharati is a cross-cutting environmental and public policy expert who works closely with government agencies to improve the governance of waste management in India. Good morning, Bharti. Welcome to the India Energy Hour. We're so delighted to have you. I've been wanting to invite you for so long, but for some reason or the other, it was not working out. So, really delighted to have you to talk about this really interesting topic of how do we deal with wastes in India and particularly growing solar waste. So, welcome to the India Energy Hour.
Hey, thanks. I'm so delighted, Sandeep and Shreya. I listened to some of your podcasts, but I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk to the two of you and also perhaps to connect with an audience that isn't the typical audience that I reach out to normally. So thanks.
That's great. So, the way we do it is in the beginning, we kind of spend some time on our guests' life history and like their professional and personal journey. So, just, I know I've known you for a few years now. So, just wanted to start by understanding like where you grew up in India, like what's your background? How did you get interested in environmental issues? How did you start Chintan? And like, tell us your professional story, which I am sure is intertwined with your personal story as well.
Yeah, I think for all of us who are in the area of environment, but not in a particular, delivery mechanism, we've all had a personal story that led us here, or at least that led us away from other options. So I grew up in Delhi. I've always lived in this city and I've really enjoyed it. And I still live here, of course. But my story was quite fascinating because I lived in a city which was a much greener city than it is now, believe it or not. And we would go to the most spectacular, little micro forests. And my father would take me to these little places which were green and they had buyer's nests. And they were near our house. And I have to confess, I grew up in Luton's Delhi. So I'd not really lived in any other part. So I'm talking of an exceedingly elite part of Delhi. But also, on the other hand, I would occasionally get a chance to travel with my parents and go to the most gorgeous countryside, whether it was Kaziranga or Uttar Pradesh. And, you have these moments, and I think we should never underestimate how children remember things and digest those things. So, for example, seeing just a Saras crane and its mate in the fields somewhere near Lucknow, or being in Kaziranga, or going to Bharatpur, as it was called, Kela Devi National Park, all of those things. And I really developed a great interest in the outdoors and trees and nature, particularly. And as I grew up and I started wandering around the city outside the Delhi Gymkhana Club and outside Luton's Delhi. I saw more things and I spoke with more people, and it was quite horrifying actually to see the stark contrast, but it was also very sad. And as a young person, I went to Delhi University, and the kind of people I met were completely different from the kind of people who I had as friends. And you have pretty intense conversations, and you're not used to either the rhetoric or you're not. And so I think you open your mind much more and you see much more. And I think that was really the beginning of my, at 17, going away from what would be I'm still a person of extreme privilege, but at least going on a path that was more inclined to environmental justice than only, conservation, so to say, which would have been the obvious thing for me. It was really in my heart. And I was also deeply interested in politics, and I tried various career experiments, but essentially I couldn't find a job. And I found many jobs. I also took a few jobs. They were very nice. They were very plush. But in the end, I basically had to start Chintan because I couldn't find anything that was urban and that was looking at justice, but environment, and that combined research as well as action, as well as talking about a very Indian kind of environmentalism, because you have to look at poverty. And I was also lucky that just before that, or just during that, the Heinrich Boll Stiftung gave me a bunch of money and I could go and do a little piece of research. It was quite a bit of money. And I really took that opportunity to deep dive into these issues. And before that, as a student, WWF gave me money, and that was great. And I basically went and met the first poor waste picker that I could, which is outside their office in Lodi Estate. And through him, I formed a huge sociogram, and it took me a year. And I met every single actor that I could possibly meet in the NCR. And I tried to understand the politics of materials and what that meant. And it kind of did really well in terms of the history. I ended up with a master's in history. And I think the two, ironically, I wouldn't say ironically, I would say much to one's own surprise, blended really well. Because on one hand, we were looking at subaltern movements, and we were looking at how people looked at emancipation beyond the Indian National Congress's idea of freedom from the British. They were actually, the farmers of coastal Andhra wanted freedom from repressive salt taxes. And as we know, people, from tribal India wanted another kind of freedom. And so I think all of those big ideas really conflated with me and made me think quite differently. And it made my work, my study of history really enriched me. And that was really how Chintan is quite different from anybody else, because Chintan will never say, here's all this waste and here's this technology and why doesn't the government do something? Perspective will always be, here's this waste and how do you reduce it, and what do you do with the people mining it, and how do you look at jobs, and how does a change impact poverty, and how do you place women also in that solution matrix, and what do the people themselves have to say, and how do we train ourselves to listen to them? So that's how it began. Of course, in the end, I went to Johns Hopkins and studied public policy. And that was also fascinating for me because it was, I think just being in another system of education that taught was firstly an eye-opener. But secondly, I'd never worked so hard in any education system. And I think thirdly, it really taught me the importance of a certain kind of data. And it was riveting for me to rethink numbers and rethink how the policy world globally operated. And sometimes it was disturbing, but mostly it was useful.
Thank you for this very elaborate description of your life. It's great to hear this, As I like to call it, you had kind of a Buddha moment for you, You went out, you decided that this is where I want to be, kicking all the plush jobs that could have come by. You said that Chintan is different because you don't wait for the government or the policymakers to come ahead, make a policy. But do you engage with government in a certain way? Do you like to or would want to influence policies in some way? And is there any great example where you did that?
We do that all the time. What I meant was not that we don't wait for government. It is that when we see a problem, we measure the problem, and we measure it quantitatively and qualitatively through multiple perspectives, but we always prioritize perspectives of workers, of the poor, of women, but we also add our own understanding of it. And then we use data. because I think without data, what are you going to measure? What are you going to change? But we do. And if you look at a lot of the policy around waste, you'll find a strong impression of Chintan, whether you look at, even some of the issues around plastics, and you could look at earlier, even as long ago as 2009, the whole climate action framework they talked about waste pickers and waste and so on. At that point, Chintan worked largely on those issues. Now we work on other issues like circular economy and climate change and air pollution. But through our history, we've engaged with government. It's a key part of who we are. And I myself serve on several boards, including the Delhi Pollution Control Committee. And it's complicated, but it's rewarding as well.
That brings me to the subject of our conversation here. Central government has come with a recent policy which has already kick-started that all the single-use plastic is now banned in the country, which includes earbuds, balloon sticks, candy and ice cream stick, cutlery items, including plates, etc. And this was initiated last year and has now kicked in. First, would want you to brief our listeners what does this policy entail and what kind of implications are we looking at on both the plastic industry and also plastic pollution.
Okay, so first of all, it's a really important policy. If you look at the items, you'll find one thing, and I urge you also to look at Chintan's study, Plan the Ban, which tells you a lot. But the study actually identifies across various cities in India what exactly is the impact or what is the role of waste pickers' income in plastics. And we found 40 to 60% of their income was dependent on plastics. And then we tried to understand what plastics and what not. And all the things that are in the ban, items that are not recyclable, every single one of them. And not only not recyclable, they have no value to waste pickers in terms of livelihoods. So that is the first thing. So I think this is particularly important because too often you ban all kinds of things without thinking about what happens to other people. I think this law is important because despite the fact that corporates like Amul and Dabur are really upset, and they've in fact been through other organizations trying to, postpone the ban and trying to give all kinds of excuses. Remember that first we got 60 days, the public got 60 days to give comments on it. After that, the public got 1 year to prepare. The public includes corporates. And if after 1 year you come up and say, well, it's going to take us 2 years to produce straws in paper because these are not made in India. I mean, come on, we're talking of make in India. What were you doing for this 1 year? All this while, all you were doing was trying to use your corporate might and push the law away. And India has a huge problem with marine plastics. I mean, we don't spend that kind of money measuring it. But everywhere you look, even if you stand at the Taj Mahal and look behind it, the Yamuna has, as it flows by at the back, you can see multicolored plastics flow by. So there's a huge issue. The Ganga is the 7th biggest carrier of plastics into the ocean. We are seeing a huge crisis. It's important for us to stop it, not just because there's a crisis in water. That same microplastic comes back to human beings. I mean, if you look at samples of human tissue, basically across the world, you look at honey, you look at beer, every one of them has microplastics. And these are things we eat and drink. We are plasticizing our insides, which is very problematic. So I feel that firstly, it's important. But secondly, I think the impact is that there will be a lot of alternatives. And the alternatives means 3 things. Firstly, there'll be bio-based alternatives, right? Paper or whatever. And to me, it's important that we look at behavior alternatives, which is how to drink without a straw. Because as long as we keep thinking of alternatives as mostly material alternatives, we're going to be stuck in another kind of consumption. And it may not result in microplastics, but it results in harvesting resources of various kinds. And, too often you have food grade standards, and too often that means virgin materials. So where do you think paper straws are going to come from? Where do you think, cane-based or bamboo-based or reed-based, earbuds are going to come from? I think we have to think of reusable things. We have to look at repairable things and long-term things as well as behavior change, because you actually don't need a straw. If you think your drink is clean and your glass is clean, and if you think they're dirty, why are you drinking from them to begin with? Do you want typhoid? So the straw is not going to change that, right? So I think there's going to be a moment of a major dematerializing of our society. I'm not saying it's the biggest, but it is really, really important. And it's an opportunity that we should seize and really talk about how we can do without any alternative. I mean, do you really need an alternative for everything? Design comes in quite importantly. I mean, you even now have things, and these are not in the list, but things like shampoo bottles, which themselves dissolve into shampoo. So things like that, a big shift. I think the second thing is you will still have material, your candy bar can't be replaced with nothing. So you'll have to do much more composting. Otherwise, all those biodegradable materials will end up on the landfill. They already are. But if they land up on the landfill, they're likely to be part of the many landfill fires that we have. And let's face it, there is no such thing as no landfill fires in this day and age in India. And we'll have more methane and carbon dioxide. And we don't want that. We want to fight climate change. We want to fight plastic pollution. And they're basically two sides of the same coin because plastics is derived from fossil fuels, as you know. And the third thing is compostable plastics because those are exempt 100% from the rules, and the rules say so quite clearly. And the story of compostable plastics is that even if you go to a allegedly progressive place like San Jose, even at the airport, they'll tell you that, put your compostables here. But basically, in any neighborhood, at least I couldn't find any single facility that composted these compostable plastics because you can't just put them in your composting bin. They need a very industrial type facility. They're pretty robust. And those bonds have to be broken down. And they weren't being recycled. We were trashing them, much to our own sorrow. And so my question is that these compostable plastics shouldn't end up being the new menace. Because remember, all the images that we see around plastics, elephants eating plastics and cows eating plastics, there's every reason that will be repeated with compostable plastics. Why? Because compostable plastics retain their shape. They will still go and choke you in your tummy and all of that until they actually turn, into water and whatever, carbon dioxide or whatever they have to. So unless you actually collect them and put them through that industrial facility, they will continue to pose various kinds of hazards to animals and they'll still choke your nalas and your drains. So let's not be delusioned. And they take a really long time to break down and only in specific facilities. So I say put compostable plastics under EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, which means that manufacturers are responsible for them. So please collect them back. There's no other way to do this. So that's, I think, a third thing that has to be done. And it's a great time to do this because there aren't too many manufacturers and whoever imports it should be, the importer should be liable. And it's a good way to, while the going is good and while we still have formal manufacturers and we have formal importers, we can still start it so that we have a system in place because, in India, too often we react after there's a disaster. So I think this would be my third implication of these rules. And I think the fourth, which is also important, is we need standards for alternatives because you don't want some chlorine bleached white paper being out there as a benign alternatives. We're not going to get 100 chances to upgrade our materials economy. And we don't want toxicity in it. It's no point composting something which is full of chlorine because that's not even compost. Then that's really toxic waste. So I think that's a fourth thing. And the Bureau of Indian Standards really needs to jump in. And we need to do this very publicly. And my final one around implications is we can, plastics are governed by two rules. One is the one you just described, which is a series of bans, except for plastic bags where it's a series of thickenings. And the second one is the extended producer responsibility, which puts 3 plastics under the producer's ambit, which is Tetra packs, PET bottles, and multi-layered packaging. And they have percentages, and every year that percentage goes up, and so on. And the challenge there is that it says you have to pick up, say, let's assume 40%. The challenge is that we don't know what is 40% because we have no baseline, because we don't have a registry. And nobody wants to put a registry. And my belief is that you need a district-wise registry. Because if you're going to push sustainable waste management, and there's still a role for that, you need to do it locally. And you can't do it with state-wise data because there's a big difference between, say, the waste that's going to come out, say, of Simla versus Una, for example. So you need to do it district-wise so that it can be dealt with in specific areas. You could have fragile ecozones in some districts, and you might want to do specific actions there. So without a very detailed nuanced plastic registry, which is publicly available, safeguarded, or rather the oversight from a third party, because I believe, given that even the pollution control boards don't have the capacity to render their basic work, we don't want to give them extra work that won't be done. We just want to be pragmatic about it, but totally in the public space so that we know who's meeting what. And even if they're not meeting their goals, let's know that. Let's understand why. Let's find solutions.
I have an industry and a cost specific questions, parents of a business journalist. There would be several alternatives to single use plastics. There's jute, there's sustainable plastic, but you mentioned there parents to that as well. But I'm sure there would be alternatives, and technology and innovation helps you find such alternatives. But there's this whole industry that is dependent on single use plastics, FMCG, food delivery in recent years, and they all have to shift to an alternative. With regards to just FMCG, we might look at a cost going for these FMCG products. Given that the country is already facing food, WPI inflation, etc., the cost of FMCG products have already gone up. With the change in these plastic norms, this is expected that the cost of most of these food products might go up, packaged food products. What are your thoughts on this? Because in the end, I as a consumer will bear it. And I as a consumer who is not sensitized enough on these plastics, and then I have to bear this cost. Also, can you address, we bring down the cost of these alternatives that are there?
So, a couple of things. I think, first of all, the question I always like to ask, and this is not intended to be anti-consumer because even I'm a regular middle class consumer, is what we're paying, how much is externalized? Because too often the cost of picking up, say, the Tetra Pak and so on is externalized. In fact, these are extremely unsustainable forms of packaging. So rather than saying that fine, for a tiny little apple juice, we're going to get a paper straw and that's going to cost more, and we can't even now package it in paper and we have to think. I have three responses to that. The first one is, what the hell were you doing? Dabur and Amul are not small people. They're big people. It's not that they were proactively doing anything in the last 1 year that they've bothered to tell us. So firstly, there's that problem, of not wanting to do. And I think corporate inertia has played a very big role to bring us where we are today in terms of our plastic pollution. It's not just inertia, the history of the laws, and I know I'm diverting, but the history of plastic rules since 1996 shows us that there's always been a big role of the plastic industry and in making the rules medieval, backward, and non-progressive, and in increasing rather than reducing plastic, and using and citing consumer convenience. But the consumer convenience can't be the only metrics by which you produce materials, firstly. Secondly, I think we need to start asking what other options are there, rather than just these Tetra Packs, which are very, very difficult to recycle, firstly. You don't even recycle 100% of them. So we need to start looking at and investing in, and the government should also be investing in improved technologies around carrying beverages, and can we reuse those? Can we do refills? And at a much smaller level, you see that all over the world and not just the developed world. Actually, a lot of it is in the developing world, and a lot of it is even imprinted on our psyches. So I think that's the second thing, is to try and invest in reuse, invest in refills, and invest in new kinds of packaging that doesn't contain these externalized environmental risks. I think the third thing that we want to think about is about, when you look at costs, I think we need to talk about what real costs are. And I don't think it's possible for us to do that for everything. It's just not possible. It's too much effort, too much time. But when a product comes into question, I think we should have a really public debate, because we shouldn't allow these debates to be about, here we're giving all these little children juice and Tetra Packs with plastic straws and the government is so heartless. I'm willing to look at straws for people who are genuinely ill and they also don't need plastic straws. But I can understand that if you're in hospital, if you have various physical and other challenges, you might need that. So my response is that about people working in these. Firstly, I'm not excited about talking about people overseas working in these. It's not that I don't care about workers of other parts of the world, but a lot of it is also imported into India. And the second thing is that with 1 year given, nobody's come up with a plan of how to phase it out. Nobody's come up with a plan on who will make it, who will set it up. There are so many artisanal skills in India that do exactly this. I mean, you go down any highway and people are making muras out of a rope and so on. I'm not seeing a role for jute, to be honest, but all these other materials, and you need to learn to scale those up and you need to invest in those. And when I say you, I think, in my humble opinion, partly government and many arms of government, including, the micro enterprises and the small industries. And I don't believe it can only be cottage industry. It can also be micro enterprises. It can be small scale industry. But I also think we should be a little more sensible about this and do it in stages. And I don't mean straws in stages. I mean, you can jolly well import it if you had thought about it. And you can jolly well test what is working, what is not working. But, corporate India has decided that it won't, especially the two brands I mentioned, have decided to go on an offensive. They don't care about the country. They don't care. They're just here to take our money and become rich and live like rich people in this country and run away if needed.
That's really comprehensive. Thank you. I was reading a statistic a few weeks back about, like, if plastic waste were to go the way it is today, I think by 2050 they'll contribute something like 2.2 gigatons or something, which is sort of equivalent to almost 600 coal plants. And so I think this is a very good start, as you described, but there's a long way to go. But I think what I want to do next is take this plastic ban as like a starting point to understand what could be a much bigger problem in the future, or not much bigger, but a vastly major upcoming problem, which is that India has ambitious targets for solar. By 2030, 500 gigawatts is the target. And then, that subsequently will need to be scaled up if India has to achieve net zero target. One study says about 5,000 plus gigawatts of solar would need to be installed to achieve a net zero. So having said that, some people estimate that about 3,600 tons of cumulative solar waste will be produced by 2030 if India were to meet the target. So I want to understand, does India have a robust solar waste management policy? Even bigger question, what is the state of overall solid waste management policy in India? So, I mean, this is potentially a very big problem, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So, firstly, it's very fascinating. For the last 4 years, we've been trying to talk to the Ministry of Environment, including various officials, about this very problem, and talking to, other ministries and saying, well, you already have a solar waste problem. A very interesting response we get is, no, you don't have a problem yet, because the minimum life of any solar panel is 10 years. And we're busy reminding them that solar's been in the market at a smaller level, but say in Ladakh for the longest time, in many parts of Uttaranchal for the longest time. And what they tell us now is that the MNRE has put a committee in place where the same old government officials who already made the same old errors and basically screwed the whole country with their terrible approaches are going to do further thinking and basically, pollute us further, which I find so frustrating. But nonetheless, be that as it may, it's our job to be institutionally. Chintan is supposed to be optimistic, whether or not personally I feel frustrated. And we don't know what they contain, because every time we talk to them, they're like, "Wo chal raha hai ab." You talk to them. There's no introspection. And there's no understanding that we made an error. We started the e-waste rules badly. They're still not implemented. Why aren't they implemented? Because solar will follow exactly the same trajectory. Let me take a step back. So for anything like that's a material that cannot be instantly reused or easily rejigged or easily locally repaired, or that has either toxicity that is obvious, which normally nobody talks about, but which has recoverable items. For E-waste, it's often, people used to say gold, but the real thing is really copper. And you have to collect it and you have to give it to authorized recyclers. Not all the authorized recyclers take everything because, for example, nobody really wants to take tube lights because it's A, full of mercury, and it doesn't have real mal, as they say. So what's the point taking it? And you have to, in fact, pay. And that makes it difficult because who wants to pay $80 a tube light for recycling? That really ought to be built into the price. But anyway, be that as it may, we'll need to do the same with solar. And we'll probably meet the same challenges. In my opinion, the e-waste rules were terrible. They continue to be rules which were flawed both in assumption and in clause right in the beginning, because they knew that the informal sector was channelizing all of it. And the first draft actually included informal sector, and we did see some informal sector trying to organize itself in order to legalize its work, which would have been a good idea. But then subsequently, there were no incentives. There were no inclusive guidelines. So what's happened is that the rules exist, people struggle, but you don't have anybody picking anything up, say, from the mountains, same as plastics. You have a very robust informal sector that creates a lot of pollution, and stays informal, and has ended up just being suppliers to people to meet their EPR targets, because e-waste is also covered in EPR. I mean, the law is EPR oriented, and they don't improve their work. They're not able to be mainstreamed, and their work is not able to be counted, and it pollutes. So it's been the kind of law you make when you're half blind and you don't realize that the informal sector is critical. Now, the challenge is, whatever is the e-waste challenge, the challenge is not to fall into the same pit for solar. And for solar, what we feel is quite important is, firstly, to actually do a real-time study and understand what will be the real incentives, whether they're fiscal or otherwise, to collect solar, because solar is found in more remote places. You go to, the Desert National Park, in the middle, there's this one cottage that's completely, or hut, completely with solar panels embedded all around it. And you have, these really endangered birds flying left, right, and center. So how do you retrieve from places that are so remote? So I think we have to really understand what are those incentives. And I think that's one. And the second is, the end of it is technology. So who's going to extract all those materials, and with what efficiency, and who's going to buy them? And at what rate, and what subsidies do we need for that? Because it's not automatically, a win-win. It's not profitable. In fact, waste is not profitable by and large when you formalize it. And that's where you need other kinds of incentives. And you also need disincentives. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to start preparing, along with the International Solar Alliance, a wider understanding that solar waste is a real thing and it needs to be handled. And I'm not against, getting solar waste, say, to one particular point if they have, because these are going to be very expensive technologies. The more you try to extract more sophisticated materials, rare earth metals, the more expensive it is. It's also more hard. And you have to, otherwise you'll go on mining forever. How much are you going to mine? And then you always say that China is a geopolitical threat, but China will be a geopolitical threat for many reasons, including monopoly over resources, which you need, because otherwise how do you transition to a low carbon economy? So if you don't convert to circular economy now, you'll always be dependent, and you'll always have this, beggar relationship with China, and the world will. I'm not talking of India, I'm talking of the world. So I think it's super important that we start understanding and putting money in, and don't expect it to be a profitable venture. That's my bottom line. Because profits aren't about just finances. Profits are also about your geopolitical security, about your access to raw materials, about, preventing pollution. We've seen it in so many cycles. I mean, there's been pharma pollution, there's been plastic pollution. We're looking at pollution from organic waste burning up in landfills. So we need to understand that people pay a cost with their bodies, and there's no accounting for that cost. And because there's no accounting, we don't want solar to go down that way. We want to learn from our own flawed history of the past several years how not to make that error again.
That's really interesting. I mean, this is a bit provocative also. I mean, if I interpret what you're saying is correct, that, recycling of these solar and other wastes may not always be profitable, right? So then my question to you is actually, who is going to invest? Like, should it be the government, or should it be like the renewable energy companies who are laying out these large tracts of solar panels? And what happens in the case of like people, like you talked about remote, like decentralized solar, like people who have rooftop solar? So what would be your vision for like how this can be done? Like, you really nicely laid out the problem, both from a government point of view, but also from the point of view of awareness and industry. But how do we go from here?
I would say that we want a really robust take back. And take backs are not impossible even in robust, remote places, because people trade and people travel. And we know that these are not things you have to bring back on a daily basis. This is not your everyday trash. It's not a piece of plastic. It's a long lasting piece of infrastructure we're talking about. So I think firstly, we want to take back, and we want to follow the same path as we have, which is bring it back, store it, itemize it, document it, and channelize it to formal recyclers. Having said that, who is a formal recycler, right? And like you said, who's going to set it up? So my understanding is that I don't think we should ask companies that are laying out these, solar thing, because it won't be in their area of expertise. You don't want to punish people. I'm not a person who's saying punish people. It's their business to give solar energy. They might not be the best waste recycling company managers. So don't deviate their skills. Let them do what they're doing very well. But I think the government definitely has to put in a part of this as EPR, so that it has a little bit of money and set this up. And while, people say the government shouldn't recycle, we should really look at a public-private partnership, because I feel that the day that you don't put government in it, the accountability reduces. I've obviously criticized government a lot on your program, but what I'm saying is that government, I still believe that if there's one person I want to engage with, one entity, it is government, because government is us. And the errors are collective, even though I might not have agreed with them initially and we tried that they shouldn't happen. But the point is that at least government is accountable to people. At least government is a thing that belongs to the country. Private entities are there to run an efficient profit-making business. Sometimes, as in the case of Dabur and Amul, it's not in favor of the country, at least in the context of plastic. And sometimes, as in the case of many other companies, including solar companies, it's something we really, really need, and it's very important. So I think here we are at this crossroads, and I'm really looking forward to a whole new model of investment, rather than tell, like in e-waste, they had all these private players and most of them have struggled a lot. Very few of them have survived the decade or the decade and a half. Many of the early companies have folded up because they didn't get enough materials. So I'd rather have just a couple of them, or even one, with public-private kind of partnership, very transparent, and make sure they at least get the materials. Because if they don't get them, then they don't run according to their business plan. And that was the story with e-waste. They never got anything, and then they found it really cheap to sell back what they collected, what little they collected, to the informal sector and not run their factories at all. So we'd rather that they get enough solar waste. We'd rather that if they're not making the money that they need to, and I'm not sure it'll ever break even because we've never done such a plan, use that EPR money and plug it in. I mean, pollution is a real thing. I don't believe that everything can be a business model. Composting, for example, will never make a lot of money for you. And we know that. We know that from the history of composting, big and small in India. That's why you need to do it in a decentralized way, because decentralized models of composting, for example, are able to kind of run themselves because nobody's really making the money there. People are just about breaking even and managing to keep it going. But if you do it as a large business, sooner than later, all of them have folded up because it's difficult to run that. And I say that for solar also, don't expect money to be made on retrieving the materials in them. You have to have subsidy. Great if you make money, but let's not put that burden on anybody.
Just out of curiosity, shouldn't the renewable energy companies which are setting up solar power plants be entrusted with the responsibility of, recycling the solar panels that they are setting up? You are a keen birder yourself, so you would also know about this whole GIB issue that has come up in Rajasthan, where just because there are solar power plants coming up, there's this endangered bird, which is more endangered because of that. There is a severe lack of environmental impact assessment in renewable energy. It has gotten away for all these years because it's green energy. So after 10 years, 25 years, what happens to those solar panels? No one cares because, well, we are green energy. Shouldn't this responsibility be entrusted on these people? We are aiming 500 gigawatt. Even if it were to come up, the cost implication would be as much, but that could very well be passed on. If I am paying 2.5 rupees for solar,
What I probably didn't say, what I implied, and I didn't realize it wasn't clear, was that when I said you have to understand from the e-waste model, the e-waste model is primarily EPR model, which is that if you're Panasonic or Sony or whatever you are, you have to take back. So for sure, there's an EPR model required if we're learning from the e-waste. But EPR doesn't mean recycling, and I'm very clear about that. You're responsible for bringing back after a certain number of years the exact number of panels that you have installed. And you've talked of two things. You've talked of EIA and you've talked of take back. And so I think there's no doubt that you have to have an EPR model if you're installing. But I'm also saying in the same breath that people who are installing might not be the best actors to actually run a recycling plant. It's a whole different ball game. The EPR requires them to bring back these things and invest in it and so on. You will still need a separate arm, which is basically recycling. And that recycling will not make money, is the thing. And that recycling needs a lot of other kinds of support. And one of the supports is, and I said that quite clearly actually, was that we have to channelize the waste, because in e-waste, one of the reasons many factories closed down is they never got any e-waste because nobody was investing in channelizing it and the EPR was very weak. So if you don't have waste, you can't to begin with run a recycling company. But if you have waste, then you have the option of running that company. And even if you don't make profits and you're propped up, it is in public interest, was my point. So of course you have to have accountability, but you have to have very specific kinds of accountability. I would never want Renew to get into recycling because that's just not what it does unless it proactively offers. These are very specific skill sets. These are very specific trades. A lot of recycling is about trading at the right level. But yes, you are responsible for feeding your waste, collecting it and feeding it back into the authorized chain. And that's where we've gone wrong with e-waste. We woke up late. Our first list didn't have almost half the e-waste that was channelized and that is actually exists in the market. And there was no formal chain. And then on top of that, there was no incentive for anyone to recycle anything. So that's exactly what I've been actually pointing out. Talking about EIA, well, I don't know if you've been reading my pieces, but I have been in my Hindustan Times column talking about this quite a lot, including yesterday, but even previously, quite a bit about birds and not just solar, but also wind and so on. And sighting is a huge challenge. And everywhere in the world, including in EU, I'm not sure I wrote this in the column because I think I ran out of words, but in the EU, every time I would try to go birding, if I was there, I would end up with scientists and they were all young people and they had to basically earn a living and they didn't have too many jobs. And one of the jobs that they had was to go and understand the biodiversity around proposed wind or proposed solar. And for example, in wind, they had to understand where were the bats' habitats. And then there was a code about your distance to it and all the various other things so that you could preserve ecosystems and you just couldn't sight things in certain places. So you obviously have to relook at siting because you need biodiversity. It's not that you need it. It's your moral duty to preserve all of it. And of course, we want to go low carbon. I'm in total agreement with you. And I have actually talked about it quite publicly, quite a lot.
That's excellent. I'm intrigued by recycling of solar waste. When I read one article which said almost 80% of raw materials of solar panels can be sort of like recycled. If that is the case, that seems like a very significant number. So while it may be the case that, the recyclers may not make money, but from an Atmanirbhar point of view, right, like, you need that material, like you said, like, you don't want to continue to keep mining, from copper to, nickel to cobalt to actually use in the solar panels. So maybe perhaps that could be an incentive in terms of self-sufficiency for government to subsidize. Do you have any like concluding thoughts on like how Indian government should create a structure of recycling around solar? Like should they create another PSU? Or you said public-private partnership, but some entity has to drive that, right? Is there an existing entity that is capable of driving that? And if not, what should a new entity look like?
So, first of all, I just hate making more, I just don't like more and more institutions coming up, because even the present ones, it kind of makes a lot of gray areas in terms of responsibility. And you see that all the time. You look at that in air pollution and you don't know who's in charge of what. So that is for sure. Secondly, I'm not a person who likes to sit there and say, oh, I'm a policy expert and here you should do a new entity or not, because I say, let's look at the numbers. Firstly, I think government does not need an incentive. Government should never need an incentive. Government is not a citizen, either a corporate citizen, as some people like to call it, and I don't, but just for the sake of easy semantics, or individuals. That's not government. Government's job is to protect us from pollution, protect our security, protect our territorial integrity. And so I think government should just do it because, as I said, Make in India, which you said Atmanirbhar, but Make in India is the thing. But I would say then you already have those policies. I would say, what about one of the REILs or somebody like that offering to take it on? You have plenty of PSUs. You might want to expand their domain. People who look at materials, you might want to look at the numbers and put out a call for public-private partnerships and look at a whole new entrepreneur who will come in and who has a specific ability to extract materials, to run a plant, but who will need plugins in order to break even or to make money or whatever it is. Obviously, they won't work if it's just break even. So, one hand, you have responsibility, like Shreya said, why not with the manufacturers? And I was explaining that, well, the whole EPR model is about manufacturers. And sometimes I think I'm just so exhausted this morning, but the whole thing is that they have to be responsible. But on the other end, their responsibility will come to naught if we don't actually have a really good industry at the end of it. And it has to be quite transparent. So until we look at the numbers, I know for sure I would hate to set up a new thing. I think maybe we want the ISA, the International Solar Alliance, to oversee some of this because it's international, because it's not just our problem. It's going to be a global problem. And we know that global pollution is everyone's problem. And also, India should really think strategically about the geopolitical impacts of not, moving to a circular economy model for solar panels, because you're still then going to be ever engaged in a forced way with China. And China is like, it's a unipolar world and China is leading it. And we already have problems on our borders with China, apart from the environmental borders, that problems that China causes just by exporting terrible, unrepairable items to the whole world. So the way to combat that is to start closing loops in your own territories. And I would say for me, the setup would be an ecosystem where if you imported or used a local panel to set up an industry, you would be responsible for bringing it back at a particular site. I would start with looking at nodes right now. I can already see nodes around Ladakh, around Uttaranchal, around the Northeast, around Rajasthan, but I would expand that to other places because you need nodes where collection points can grow. And I would start investing in at least one, I wouldn't say two because it's very early days, recovery plants. And I would understand three things. What can I recover? Because, 80% is theoretical. You lose a lot of materials. We know that. So what can I recover? What can I sell it to? Who can I sell it to? It probably will be more expensive than materials you can import. So what subsidy do I give for it for a buyback? Where do I eventually, after running this for a few years, where do I pass on those costs? Do I make solar more expensive after 2030? So that you don't subsidize till eternity, things like that. So I think that would be the model I would look at. And I would test it. I mean, I've seen a lot of recycling factories. The only ones that ever seem to be efficient, really small ones, and small ones will not work for solar because it's too sophisticated. And you can't decentralize and do these things. At best, you can dismantle it in a relatively at the nodal levels that I described, those little collection nodes, because you will have to dismantle it, no doubt. And that will make it efficient to transport. And maybe you'll have more than one place for different materials. But you definitely need to run it in order to understand the real economic. We've understood from plastics, we've understood from e-waste that there's a projected economics and there's a real economics. And if you don't get to the heart of it, and you never know that till you actually run the plant and you realize that I didn't know that acid was falling everywhere and I needed, my manpower cost would go up and my water cost would be, through the roof. And I asked for this much space, but actually I needed much more and my investment went wonky. These are real things that have happened in the last decade and a half in India. So we should really run this, look at what we can pick up, what we can recycle. And if you can't, who do we export it to? At what cost? What money can we get in and where do we put that money in and how much? And I think we should very seriously run this with data in the public domain. And so we know, because there's no other way of understanding where the money is to be made or lost and how much. And I've never been a votary of business plans for recycling, because although I used to be, I feel every one of them has failed us in the last decade. But I certainly believe that the money from EPR and the collection, that is, and the dismantling, that is going to be the backbone. The technology will come, the subsidy will come, the incentives will come, but all of this is laid to naught if you're not going to get flows into those facilities.
That's great. Thank you so much. We covered much more than we thought we will. That's nice. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Yeah, it has been such a pleasure. I personally learned a lot. I didn't know much about how the e-waste system worked, and it's quite comprehensive. You provided both the problem and the solution. So really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Hugely appreciated. And thank you for the work that you guys are doing, both of you. I think media, journalism, writing, thinking, these are really the greatest powerful weapons today.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with double I.